Welcome to a deep dive into the world of legendary heists. We're going to be talking about those moments in history where meticulous planning and daring execution came together to pull off what seems impossible. We've got a whole stack of sources detailing these incredible heists. The Antwerp diamond heist, the Great Train Robbery, just to name a few.
And what's so fascinating is that they really expose how even the most secure systems can be vulnerable. It's like a constant battle of wits between the people who are trying to protect things and the people who are trying to take them.
Absolutely. So let's set the stage. We're going to start with the heist of the century. The Antwerp diamond heist back in 2003. Antwerp, Belgium, the diamond capital of the world. Billions of dollars worth of diamonds going through the Antwerp Diamond Center. You would think it was impenetrable.
And you'd be right to think that. It had 10 layers of security. I mean, you're talking infrared heat detectors, a seismic sensor, Doppler radar, a magnetic field, and get this, the vault door, over 100 million possible combinations.
Yeah. Wild.
Yeah.
It's a real testament to how much those diamonds are worth. But, as we're about to see, even the most sophisticated system, you can get through it if you've got enough human ingenuity, I guess you could call it.
Determination as well.
Yeah, determination. And that's where Leonardo da Bartolo, the mastermind, comes in. Our sources describe him as a charismatic Italian guy who just had this knack for detailed planning and a real deep understanding of human nature.
He knew that security isn't just about technology, it's about people. It's about routine. It's about those flaws that just come built into any system that relies on people, behaving in predictable ways. He studied all of that meticulously, looking for those weak points that he could take advantage of.
So how did Notar Bartolo and his team actually start this incredibly elaborate plan?
So they actually started by getting right into the Diamond Center. They rented an office, under a fake name, of course, and that gave them 24-hour access to the building. Yeah, they could just observe security, analyze the guard routines, really pinpoint those vulnerabilities. That was just the start, though. This was an 18-month process of planning and preparation.
It sounds like they really were playing the long game here. They knew that patience and observation would be key to their success. Our sources detail how they went to extraordinary lengths. They built a replica of the vault just to practice.
It makes sense, though, right? If you think about it, they had to familiarize themselves with the layout, the mechanisms, any potential problems they might face. It was like a dress rehearsal for the main event.
Okay, so let's talk about the tunnel. This is the thing that just sounds like it's straight out of a movie. They dug a 27-meter tunnel from a neighboring building to get around the main security for the Diamond Center. That's massive.
It was a huge feat of engineering. They had to carefully plan it, get the resources. It took a ton of time. Think about how much earth they had to excavate. And they had to reinforce the tunnel, too. They didn't want it collapsing on them. And they had to make sure it led exactly where they wanted it to go.
It wasn't just digging a hole. They were creating a secret passage, a hidden pathway to what they wanted. And then on top of that, they still had to get through the 10 layers of security inside the Diamond Center itself. How did they do that?
It was a very multifaceted approach and tailored to each layer. Polyester shields to get past the infrared sensors. They disabled alarms, covered cameras. They even made this handcrafted aluminum plate to get past the vault's magnetic field. Every obstacle had a specific solution.
It's incredible how they combine that meticulous planning with the ability to adapt. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They had a plan A, but they were ready to switch to plan B if they needed to.
They tried to think ahead to what could go wrong, and they came up with solutions ahead of time because their success was going to depend on their ability to think on their feet and adapt to anything unexpected that might pop up.
There is one detail that still has investigators scratching their heads, though. The vault's access code. 100 million possible combinations. How do you even begin to crack something like that?
Honestly, that part is still a mystery. There's lots of speculation. Some people think they used a tiny little camera to record the combination as it was being entered, maybe with help from someone on the inside. Whatever they did it. And that shows just how dedicated they were to overcoming even the most difficult challenges.
That is the perfect example of these guys combining meticulous planning with calculated risks. They were really pushing the boundaries of what everyone thought was possible. So they get to the vault. What happens next?
Well, they used all that planning, all those honed skills,
Okay.
and they just worked quickly and efficiently. They emptied out 123 out of the 160 safe deposit boxes. They got away with over $100 million worth of diamonds, gold, and jewels. Just an incredible amount of loot. It really shows you how precise they were and how good they were at executing their plan.
It's hard to even imagine that much wealth just disappearing. But even the best laid plans, they can fall apart. And in this case, Notar Bartolo's operation was brought down by a surprisingly simple thing.
And that just goes to show how important forensic science is in these criminal investigations. It's often the smallest details that end up leading to the big breakthrough.
So what was the tiny detail that ended up bringing down this meticulously planned house of cards?
A half-eaten sandwich. They found it in a trash bag, just tossed carelessly near the scene, and there was a receipt in the bag, too. And that seemingly insignificant little piece of evidence, well, had DNA on it, and that DNA matched Nodor Bartolo.
I mean, what are the chances? That one tiny mistake, that little moment of carelessness, all those months of planning, just undone by that.
It happens all the time. Human error can undermine even the most carefully thought out operations. No matter how well you plan, there's always the possibility of something unexpected happening. And in this case, it was a sandwich that ended up being Nodor Bartolo's downfall.
But that's not quite the end of the story. Even though they made the arrests, they never recovered most of the diamonds. And that's led to all sorts of theories about insurance fraud. Maybe even a Jewish diamond dealer being the real mastermind behind it all.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, was this elaborate heist an inside job from the very beginning? Those missing diamonds and all the whispers about a bigger conspiracy, it just adds another layer of intrigue to an already fascinating case.
The Antwerp diamond heist. It wasn't just about stealing diamonds. It was about how audacious the plan was, how brilliantly it was executed, and how fragile even the most secure systems can be. It's a story that continues to fascinate people, makes you wonder about the real motives behind it all, how far the conspiracy might go, and of course, what happened to all those missing diamonds.
It really is a story that reminds us that the world of high-stakes crime is full of intrigue and deception, where nothing is quite what it seems, and where the pursuit of justice is a constant game of cat and mouse.
Absolutely. Now let's shift our focus to a heist that shook Britain to its core, a robbery that became a symbol of audacious crime.
Get ready to dive into the world of the Great Train Robbery, a heist that captured the public's imagination and left a permanent mark on British history.
The year is 1963, and a seemingly ordinary overnight Royal Mail train making its way from Glasgow to London becomes the target of this incredibly audacious robbery. It was orchestrated by a gang of 15 men, led by a man named Bruce Reynolds.
This heist wasn't just about the money. It was about how incredibly bold it was, how meticulously planned it was, and all those unexpected twists and turns that led to the gang getting caught. It's a story about careful planning, daring execution, and the relentless pursuit of justice.
Our sources tell us that Bruce Reynolds, this charismatic figure in London's underworld, planned this thing for months. He studied the train's route, the routines of the crew. He even got getaway vehicles, Land Rovers that they disguised as military vehicles so they blend right into the landscape. It's fairly clever how they use deception to hide their criminal intentions.
Yeah, they were masters of disguise. They knew that blending in was just as important as standing out. They wanted to appear completely ordinary so no one would notice them until it was absolutely necessary.
But even the most carefully thought out plans need some crucial information. And in this case, they got it from an unlikely source, an inside man.
Yep, the Ulster man.
He worked as a security officer for the Royal Mail, and he gave the gang the critical information about the really high-value cargo that was going to be on that train. That information was really important. It confirmed their target and let them fine-tune their plan. Talk about a betrayal of trust. This insider, his actions played a key role in the success of the robbery. It just goes to show how one person can have a huge impact even on the most secure system. So they had their plan. They had their inside information. How did they actually carry out this robbery?
Okay, so picture this. It's a dark night, no moon, the Royal Mail train speeding through the British countryside. The gang tampered with the signal lights, forced the train to stop in a remote location, a place called Brago Bridge. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and someone might spot them. Too late, and the train would just keep going.
That must have been a really tense moment, trying to balance precision and risk. What happened when the train actually stopped?
Under cover of darkness, they overpowered the crew. Unfortunately, that included assaulting the driver. A reminder that these heists, even if they seem glamorous in some ways, were crimes with real victims.
Yeah, it's important to remember that. Behind this image of the heist that we might have in our minds, there were real people who were hurt, and the robbers didn't care about their safety at all. So the train stopped. The crew's been subdued. What happens next?
They uncoupled the carriage that had all the valuables in it, and they took it about a mile down the track to a spot they had already picked out. And there, under the cover of darkness, they unloaded 120 bags of money, a total of 2.6 million pounds, which, if you adjust for inflation, would be about 50 million pounds today.
That's an insane amount of money, and they did it all so carefully and flawlessly. So they had their loot. Where did they go to hide out?
They went to a place called Leatherslade Farm. It was an abandoned farmhouse, and as we'll find out later, the fact that they picked a place so close to the crime scene played a big role in them getting caught.
So they disappeared into the night, leaving behind a lot of shocked people. But their freedom was short-lived. Why did they get caught?
Well, even though they were meticulous, they made some careless errors. They tried to burn down Leatherslade Farm to get rid of the evidence, but the fire didn't really take. And they left behind a lot of clues.
It seems that even the most clever criminals can't always predict what's going to happen. What kind of clues did they leave behind?
Fingerprints. It seems so small, but that's what got them. The investigators went through that farmhouse with a fine-tooth comb, found fingerprints everywhere. On a ketchup bottle, a Monopoly board, stuff they were using while they were celebrating with all that stolen money.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? A ketchup bottle, a Monopoly board, everyday items that ended up cracking a major case.
It's true. Those little details were like a trail of breadcrumbs leading the investigators right back to the people who did it.
So what happened next?
Scotland Yard, they were under a lot of pressure from the public. Everyone wanted these guys caught. They launched a huge investigation. They used forensic evidence, tips from people, and constant surveillance. And one by one, they tracked down the gang members and arrested them.
And the money, was it ever found?
Sadly, no. Most of it just vanished, which just adds to the mystery of the Great Train Robbery.
The Great Train Robbery really is a fascinating case. It showed how vulnerable even a seemingly secure system can be, how powerful meticulous planning can be, and how ultimately forensic science can unravel even the most carefully planned criminal operation.
It's a story that goes beyond just the crime itself. It became a cultural phenomenon. People debated about justice, about punishment, about the allure of doing something so audacious, and it showed everyone that even the best laid plans can be ruined by unexpected circumstances and human error.
It's a story that people still find fascinating today. A real testament to how stories about crime, mystery, and the pursuit of justice, how they can just stay with us.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the world of crime is incredibly complex. It's a mix of careful planning, calculated risks, and the constant threat of the law always being right there behind you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of legendary heists. We've already talked about the Antwerp diamond heist and the Great Train Robbery, but our journey through all these incredible crimes, it's not over yet. We've got more fascinating cases to look at. Each one is really a testament to how much planning goes into these things, the daring execution, and then, of course, the relentless pursuit of justice.
Yeah, these stories, they don't just show us the brilliant methods that these criminal masterminds use. They also highlight how important the investigators are, the ones who put the puzzle pieces together, analyze all the evidence, and ultimately bring the people who did it to justice.
Exactly. So let's move on to a heist that might not be as well known as some of the others, but it's still incredibly audacious and historically significant. The Wilcox train robbery back in 1899.
This heist takes us back to the Wild West, a time of legendary outlaws, daring train robberies, and this constant battle between lawlessness and the people trying to uphold the law.
And right at the center of this story, we've got Butch Cassidy and his infamous Wild Bunch gang. They were a serious group of outlaws, known for their daring exploits, and of course, their ability to escape and avoid capture.
The Wild Bunch, they operated with this mix of really careful planning and then this kind of calculated recklessness. They were so skilled, they knew the terrain, they were expert horsemen, and they understood how law enforcement worked, which they used to their advantage.
So set the scene for us. Where did this robbery happen, and what made it so different?
All right, so picture this. Wyoming, 1899. A train with two sections is going through this vast, really rugged landscape. Now, the Wild Bunch, they knew that the second section of the train often carried valuable stuff, so what did they do? They targeted the first section as a distraction, which tells you a lot about their strategic thinking and how they were always trying to outsmart the law.
So they created a diversion, caused chaos, and then went after their real target. Yeah, it's classic.
Yeah.
But you have to have perfect timing. And you need to understand how people are going to react.
Yeah, they understood that by messing with the normal routine, they could create an opportunity, a moment of weakness that they could use to their advantage.
Okay, so how do they make this diversion happen?
They stopped the first section of the train near Wilcox Station, a tactic that a lot of outlaws used in those days. Once the train had stopped, They made the engineer move the train onto a bridge nearby. It sounds simple, but this was a key part of their plan.
Moving the train onto the bridge, why was that so important?
Because their next move was really bold. They blew up the bridge with dynamite. It was a very deliberate act, and it worked perfectly. It stranded the second section of the train and stopped it from getting to the scene.
Wow, talk about an escalation. They weren't just robbing a train, they were reshaping the landscape to fit their plan. Did they use dynamite on the train too?
Oh, yeah. They blasted their way into the train cars and into the safes. They used pure force to get to what they wanted. It was very different from the finesse and precision we saw in the Antwerp diamond heist. This was all about raw power and a willingness to use whatever it took to get the job done.
It's a good reminder that while some heists are all about careful planning and perfect execution, others are much more direct and forceful.
The Wild Bunch, they were known for being daring and for being willing to use violence if they had to. That made them both feared and, for some people, kind of admired. They were a product of their time. They lived in a world where the law was often outmatched and outgunned.
So what did they manage to get away with?
They got over $50,000 in cash, gold, banknotes. They even took some personal items like scarf pins, cufflinks, watches. It's a really interesting mix of valuable stuff and everyday things.
It does make you wonder about what they were thinking.
I think their choices reflect how a lot of outlaws in that era operated. They wanted a quick score. Anything of value was fair game.
And after this raid, they just vanished into the wilderness of Wyoming.
Like they were never there. They were experts at escaping. They used their knowledge of the terrain and their network of hideouts to stay ahead of the law. They knew the land like the back of their hand, which made them incredibly hard to track down.
The Wilcox train robbery wasn't just about the money or the stolen goods. It was a symbol of the Wild West, a time when outlaws like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid roamed free, challenging the authorities and capturing the imagination of the public.
It's a story that speaks to that lasting fascination we have with the outlaw, the idea of people who live outside the rules of society, making their own rules.
But it's really important to remember that these romanticized stories about outlaws often hide the real harm they caused. These weren't victimless crimes.
You're absolutely right. The violence they used, the disruption to transportation, the fear they caused in communities, these were real and lasting impacts that we can't ignore.
Now, let's look at another heist that used a train as the target. But this time, the motive was completely different. The Kakori conspiracy in India in 1925. This was a political act of defiance against the British rule.
This wasn't just a robbery. It was a statement, a bold act of resistance against a powerful empire. It was carried out by revolutionaries, people who were determined to get the resources they needed to fight for independence.
Our sources describe a group of people who were deeply committed to their cause, willing to risk everything for the freedom of their nation. They saw the British railway system as a symbol of oppression, a very real representation of the forces that control their lives.
And they knew that to fight British rule, they needed resources. What better way to strike a blow against the empire than to go after the very system that transported its wealth and kept its control?
They weren't just after any train. They were after a train carrying government funds, a direct attack on the financial lifeline of the British administration in India.
Their goal was twofold: get the money they needed to fuel their movement, and deliver a symbolic blow against the British Empire. It was a risky gamble. If they failed, the consequences could have been terrible.
So tell me, how did they pull off this incredibly audacious plan?
They chose a remote spot, the small town of Kakori, and they carefully studied the train's schedule and all the security measures. They were meticulous in their planning. They knew their enemy's strengths and weaknesses.
It sounds like they approached this heist with the same level of strategic thinking and tactical planning as we saw in the Antwerp diamond heist, but their motivation was completely different.
Exactly. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, something that went beyond just personal gain. This wasn't about getting rich. This was about fueling a revolution.
Okay, so they had their target. They'd planned everything out. What happened next?
On the day of the heist, they got on the train disguised as regular passengers. They blended right into the crowd. As the train got near Kakori, they made their move, overpowered the guards and passengers, took control of the situation.
That was a quick and decisive move. They minimized the risk of resistance and showed how dedicated they were to their cause.
They knew they had to act fast and decisively. No hesitation, no second guessing. Their success depended on keeping control and executing their plan perfectly.
So they had the train, the guards were subdued. What happened next?
They forced open the safe. That was the whole point. The source of the funds that would support their revolution. And inside, they found exactly what they were looking for. A large sum of government money. Once they had their prize, they disappeared, leaving everyone in shock and disbelief.
It was a bold act of defiance, a direct challenge to the British, and it sent shockwaves through the colonial administration.
The British were completely caught off guard. This wasn't just a robbery, it was embarrassing, a public humiliation. It undermined their authority and gave hope to those who wanted to challenge their rule.
So how did the British respond?
They launched a massive manhunt. They were determined to find the people responsible and to send a clear message that any rebellion would be crushed. Within a month, they arrested about 40 people. That shows you how big the investigation was and how many resources they poured into capturing those involved.
40 arrests for one robbery. That's a lot. It seems like the British government was making a point, showing their power to try and prevent future resistance.
It was a show of force, a way to say, we're in control. They wanted to crush the movement before it could grow.
What happened to the people who were arrested?
29 of them went to trial. They were charged with robbery and conspiracy. Most of them were given long prison sentences, some up to 14 years. It was a harsh punishment. It shows you how seriously the British took this act of defiance.
But the punishment wasn't just prison time, was it?
No, it wasn't. While some were acquitted or pardoned, one person got a life sentence, and 4 of them, the leaders, were sentenced to death. A tragic end for those who fought for their nation's independence, a stark reminder of the brutality of colonial rule.
The Kokori conspiracy was about so much more than stolen money. It was a key moment in the Indian independence movement. It inspired others to fight. It showed that even the powerful British Empire could be challenged.
It was a spark that ignited a flame of resistance, a testament to the power of courage and conviction when you're facing oppression.
And it's a story that shows us that heists, even though they're often driven by greed, can also be powerful acts of resistance, fueled by a desire for justice and a longing for freedom.
It's a story that shows the complex relationship between crime and politics, and how what seems like a simple act of robbery can have huge consequences, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations to fight for a better future.
Let's travel back in time now, to the early days of train travel in the United States, when the vast American West was a haven for outlaws, a constant challenge for law enforcement. Our source details the Great Train Robbery of 1870, the very first train robbery in Nevada, a state that's synonymous with gold, silver, and striking it rich.
This robbery wasn't just about stealing valuables. It was a symbol of the Wild West, a time when lawlessness was everywhere, and opportunities for daring crimes were plentiful.
It was a time when fortunes could be made or lost in a single day, and the pursuit of wealth often blurred the lines between ambition and breaking the law. Our source mentions a group of 5 men. They got a tip that a train was carrying a huge shipment of gold and silver, the lifeblood of the Nevada economy.
These were classic outlaws, driven by the dream of getting rich quick and the excitement of defying authority. They were skilled horsemen, they knew the rugged terrain, and they knew how to operate in a vast and often lawless territory.
So unlike the complex tunnels or fancy technology we've seen in other heists, these outlaws used more traditional methods.
Exactly. They used their skills and their knowledge of the land to their advantage. They didn't need gadgets or elaborate plans. They relied on instinct, cunning, and their ability to strike fast and disappear without a trace.
So how did they manage to pull off this robbery?
They rode their horses to Verdi, a small town in the middle of the Nevada landscape, and they waited for their target, the train carrying all that gold and silver. Their plan was simple, but effective. They blocked the tracks, forced the train to stop.
It's like a scene right out of a Western movie. I can picture it now. The train screeching to a halt, the outlaws peering out of the dust, their faces covered, guns drawn.
It must have been a tense moment, a clash between order and chaos. The people on the train must have been terrified, not knowing what was going to happen.
Okay, so the train stopped. The outlaws have surprised everyone. What did they do?
They stormed the train. They took control of the engine and the express cars where the valuable stuff was. They knew what they were doing.
They were after the gold and silver, the symbols of wealth in the Wild West. How much did they get away with?
They got away with about $41,000 worth of gold and silver. That was a fortune back then, enough to set them up for life. But here's the interesting part. They left some of the loot behind, about $23,000 in gold bars and silver.
They left gold behind. Why would they do that?
Even outlaws have limits, I guess. They couldn't take everything. It would have slowed them down, made it harder to escape. They had to choose speed over getting every last bit of treasure.
Yeah, and it shows that even in the world of crime, sometimes you have to be practical. So they disappeared into the Nevada wilderness, bags full of stolen treasure. But I imagine they weren't free for very long.
You're right about that. The authorities weren't going to let them get away with it. They offered a big reward for information, hired bounty hunters and law enforcement, determined to bring them in.
Money can be a powerful motivator. So what happened?
It didn't take long. They caught all 5 robbers and 3 accomplices. That shows you how effective the reward system was and how determined people were to uphold the law.
Justice was swift back then.
Yeah.
Very different from the long investigations and court battles we see today.
The Wild West was a different place. Justice was often quick and sometimes brutal. It was a time when law enforcement and vigilantes weren't so different, and chasing down outlaws was a dangerous job.
The Great Train Robbery gives us a glimpse into a time that's gone, a time when law and order were still being established in the American West, and there were plenty of opportunities for people who wanted to take advantage of the chaos.
It was a time of huge change and expansion, a time when the pursuit of wealth often clashed with the pursuit of justice, and it left behind a legacy of daring crimes, larger-than-life outlaws, and stories that still capture our imaginations.
Let's fast forward a few decades now, to the Roaring '20s, a time of prohibition, gangsters, and a surge in organized crime. Our source details a train robbery that was, at the time, the biggest in U.S. history, the Rondout train robbery of 1924.
This robbery is remarkable not just for how much money was stolen, but also for how carefully it was planned and how daringly it was executed. It shows how crime was evolving, criminals adapting their methods to the changing times.
This heist was the work of the Newton Gang, a group of brothers. They had already made a name for themselves, robbing banks and trains. Our sources say they robbed over 80 banks and 6 trains before they targeted the Rondout train. They were experienced criminals with a thirst for both money and notoriety.
They were very careful planners, known for their attention to detail and their ability to see what obstacles might get in their way. But they were also ruthless. They would use violence if they had to. They were a product of their environment, a world where organized crime was booming and the competition was fierce.
This robbery had a unique element, an inside man, who was actually a postal inspector.
Yeah, that's right. This person's involvement was critical to the success of the robbery. They were able to get into the very system they were targeting, and they got valuable information about the train schedule, the security, and, most importantly, what was being carried on the train.
Talk about a betrayal. It's hard to believe they were able to manipulate someone in a position of authority like that, someone who was supposed to uphold the law.
It shows how clever they were. They knew how to find and exploit weaknesses in systems and in people. They understood that greed and ambition could be powerful tools for getting what they wanted.
So their inside man gave them all this information. How did the robbery happen?
2 of the Newton brothers got on the mail train disguised as passengers, and they waited for the perfect moment to strike.
Timing is everything in these situations. Choosing the right moment, the moment of weakness, that can make the difference between success and failure. What happened next?
They forced the engineer at gunpoint to stop the train in Rondout, Illinois. That was the spot they'd picked out where the rest of the gang was waiting.
So this was a coordinated effort, a carefully planned operation, with people on the train and people waiting outside.
Absolutely. It all had to be timed perfectly. They had to communicate clearly and be able to adapt if something unexpected happened.
The train stopped. The rest of the gang appears. What happens next?
They did something that was pretty unusual for the time. They used tear gas bombs.
Tear gas bombs.
Yeah. To subdue the passengers and the mail clerks. They created chaos and confusion so they could move quickly and get what they wanted.
Tear gas bombs. It sounds like something out of an action movie.
Right.
Very different from the more subtle approaches we've seen in some of the other heists.
It was a risky move, but it showed they were willing to do whatever it took to succeed. They weren't afraid to escalate things, to use chaos and fear to make sure they got what they wanted.
So they took control of the train, they subdued everyone, then what?
They went to the mail car, the heart of their operation, where the money was. They used their inside man's knowledge to get past the security and into the safe.
That inside information was the key to their success. What did they find inside?
Let's just say they hit the jackpot. They stole over $3 million in cash and bonds. That was an unbelievable amount of money back then. It was the biggest train robbery in U.S. history, and it showed how meticulous their planning was, how daring their execution was, and how ruthless they could be.
An incredible haul, the result of months of planning and getting ready. But it didn't last, did it? What brought them down?
It's ironic, but it was a twist of fate. In all the chaos, one of the brothers, Doc, was accidentally shot by one of his own gang members.
Wow. Talk about friendly fire. What happened after that?
The injury wasn't fatal, but it was a problem. They couldn't just ignore a gunshot wound. They needed a doctor. And that need for medical help led them right to the police.
So their own injured brother ended up being their downfall.
Exactly. They were arrested at the hospital. Their criminal operation came to a sudden and unexpected end. It reminds us that even when you plan carefully, things can go wrong. And sometimes the smallest details can have the biggest consequences.
The Great Train Robbery is a fascinating case to study. It shows how meticulous planning and daring execution can lead to a successful heist. But it also shows how unpredictable crime can be. How one little event can change everything and lead to the criminals getting caught and justice being served.
It's a story that reminds us that the world of crime is a high-stakes gamble. Success can be fleeting, and the consequences of failure can be severe.
Now let's shift our focus to a heist that had a different kind of target, art. We're talking about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist of 1990, one of the biggest and most mysterious art thefts in history.
This heist is so fascinating because of how bold it was, the mystery surrounding it, and the fact that the artwork is still missing today. It's a case that continues to capture the imagination of art historians, investigators, and anyone who loves a good unsolved mystery.
This audacious robbery happened in Boston, a city known for its rich history, its prestigious institutions, and unfortunately its vulnerability to these daring criminal acts. Our sources describe a carefully planned operation, one that took advantage of weaknesses in the museum's security and the fact that people tend to trust authority figures.
The people who did it, they understood that security isn't just about physical barriers and alarms. It's also about how people think, the assumptions we make, and the trust we put in people who appear to be in authority.
So they used deception and manipulation to get into the museum.
That's right. They showed up at the museum late at night, dressed as police officers. They said they were responding to a disturbance. It was a brilliant plan. They were playing on the fact that people naturally respect and obey law enforcement.
And the guards, they thought they were dealing with real police officers, so they let them in. It's a classic example of how looks can be deceiving and how easily trust can be exploited.
Once they were inside, they had free rein. They quickly overpowered the guards, tied them up, and then went after specific works of art, which shows they knew about the museum's collection and had a clear goal in mind.
They weren't just random thieves grabbing whatever they could get their hands on. They had a plan. They knew exactly what they wanted. What kind of art did they take?
They stole 13 pieces, including masterpieces by Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Degas, some of the most famous and valuable artists in history.
Those are huge names in the art world. What was the total value of the artwork they stole?
Over $500 million, making it the biggest unsolved art heist ever.
That's an insane amount of money. It shows you how much value is placed on these artistic treasures. And even though there have been investigations, leads, and a big reward offered, the artwork is still gone.
The empty frames are still hanging in the museum, a haunting reminder of what was stolen, and a symbol of the mystery surrounding this case. It makes you think about how bold the criminals were, how fragile security can be, and how much we love unsolved mysteries.
It's like a piece of art history has been ripped away, leaving a void that can never be filled.
The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist highlights how vulnerable even the most important institutions can be, the challenge of protecting our cultural heritage, and the efforts to stop and solve art crimes.
It's a cautionary tale. It reminds us that security is an ongoing battle. You have to constantly be one step ahead of the people who are looking for weaknesses and want to profit from stealing priceless treasures.
It's also a reminder that while stealing art might seem tempting, the consequences are huge. It robs the world of masterpieces and leaves behind a legacy of loss and unanswered questions.
Let's switch gears again. Let's talk about a heist that was incredible because of how big it was and how clever the criminals were. The Banco Central burglary in Fortaleza, Brazil in 2005. This robbery was huge. They stole $70 million, which shows how ambitious they were and how meticulously they planned everything.
This heist wasn't just about brute force or being daring. It was about patience, precision, and this incredible feat of engineering that allowed them to get around all the normal security measures and get to what they wanted.
Our sources describe a group of people who knew that to pull off something this big, they had to think differently. They had to use a method that would get them past all those layers of security protecting the bank's valuables, What did they come up with?
They went old school. They took inspiration from ancient siege warfare. They decided to dig a tunnel.
A tunnel, we've seen that before. In the Antwerp diamond heist, it seems like tunneling is a popular way to get around traditional security.
Tunneling lets criminals work in secret. They can create a hidden path to their target, and they can strike from an unexpected direction. It takes a lot of time and effort, but the payoff can be huge.
So how did they pull off this tunnel operation?
They rented a place near the Banco Central in Fortaleza, and for 3 months, they dug this 78-meter tunnel straight to the bank vault.
78 meters. That's longer than a football field. That's an incredible engineering project. You need to know about soil mechanics, structural integrity, and you need a lot of patience.
You're right. They moved tons of earth, reinforced the tunnel, made sure it didn't collapse, and they had to make sure it was going in the right direction, leading them straight to their goal. It was a huge job. It took resources, expertise, and a lot of dedication.
But how did they keep it a secret for 3 months? They must have been moving a lot of dirt and stuff.
They were masters of disguise. They pretended to be a landscaping business. All the movement of soil and equipment actually helped them hide what they were really doing. They blended right into the city, made their criminal operation look completely normal.
That's really clever. They manipulated everyone's perception, made something as ordinary as landscaping into a cover for their incredible plan. They used the ordinary to hide the extraordinary. So after 3 months of digging, they finally reached the bank vault. What happened then?
They waited for the weekend when the bank was closed and there wouldn't be as much security. They knew timing was everything. They had to strike when the bank was most vulnerable, minimize the risk of being caught, and maximize their chance of getting away with the money.
It's careful balance, precision, timing, and opportunity. So did they succeed?
They did. They got into the vault, got past the security systems, and got away with the $70 million, leaving almost no evidence behind, a clean getaway, a real testament to their planning, patience, and how well they understood security weaknesses.
This is a classic example of a heist where brains were more important than brawn. Careful planning over brute force. But like we've seen before, even the best plans can go wrong. What led to them being caught?
There was a massive manhunt. And even though the robbers had been careful, they weren't perfect. The investigators were determined to find these criminals. They followed every piece of evidence, analyzed financial transactions, interviewed witnesses.
It just goes to show that even with technology and all the ways to move money around quickly, investigators still have to do a lot of traditional detective work. Following the money, talking to people, connecting the dots.
And it worked. They caught several of the gang members, which shows how dedicated law enforcement can be. And they recovered a good amount of the stolen money, but not all of it.
It seems that even when it seems impossible, justice can prevail. The Banco Central burglary is such a captivating story. It shows how much ingenuity and determination it takes to pull off a heist. But it also shows how important it is to be vigilant, to always be updating security measures, and to never give up on the pursuit of justice.
It reminds us that the battle between security and the people who want to break through it never ends.
Now, let's talk about a heist that was different. It captured the public's imagination, not because of how much was stolen or how complex it was, but because of who did it. The Hatton Garden heist in 2015.
This robbery, the media called it the heist of the century. It involved a group of mostly older men. They targeted a safe deposit company in London's jewelry district, a place known for wealth, luxury, and precious stones.
Our source calls them the geriatric gang, which I have to admit is a pretty funny nickname for a group of criminals. You don't often hear about heists being done by people in their 60s and 70s.
It is a funny name, but it shows how much this case fascinated the public. These weren't the typical young, quick thieves. They were experienced criminals, guys who've been doing this for decades. They saw an opportunity, and they decided to use their experience for one last big score.
So what were they after? And what made them think they could pull this off at their age?
They targeted the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company. It seemed like an impenetrable vault. Right in the middle of London's jewelry district. It was where people kept their most valuable possessions, thinking they were safe from criminals.
It sounds like a fortress, a place that was built to withstand any attempt to break in. What made them think they could get past all that security?
These men were experts. They were old-school criminals from a different era. They relied on their experience, observation, and careful planning. Not fancy gadgets or hacking. They studied the building, they figured out the security systems, they even watched the staff looking for weaknesses they could exploit.
It's like they were playing chess, thinking ahead, finding vulnerabilities, and planning their attack with precision.
And just like in chess, timing was everything. They chose to do it during the Easter weekend, when businesses were closed, the streets were quiet, and security would probably be more relaxed. They knew that holidays gave them an opportunity, a moment when people wouldn't be as careful and routines would be different.
Okay, so they had their plan. They had the time on their side. How did they get into the vault?
They used a mix of old and new methods. They used powerful drilling equipment to get through a thick concrete wall. It must have taken a lot of time and effort.
It's hard to imagine men in their 60s and 70s using heavy machinery like that, working so hard to break through a concrete wall. It shows how determined they were, how tough they were, and how much they believed they could do it.
I think they were driven by a few things. The chance to get a lot of money, the thrill of the challenge, and maybe a desire to prove that they could still outsmart the system.
So they got through the wall, got into the vault. What did they do next?
They went through the safe deposit boxes one by one, picking and choosing what they wanted. They focused on small items that were easy to carry. They knew they couldn't take everything, so they had to be smart. Take the things that would be worth the most.
That's smart. They were trying to make the most money while minimizing their risk. How much did they end up getting?
They got about 14 million pounds worth of jewelry and other valuables, a huge amount of money. It shows how successful they were. They did what everyone thought was impossible. They defied their age and what people think older people can do.
But it didn't last, right? Why did they end up getting caught?
Even though they were careful and tried to cover their tracks, they made a few mistakes. Mistakes that ended up unraveling their whole plan. They didn't realize how powerful modern surveillance technology is. They used their own cars and cell phones, which let the police track them. It shows that even experienced criminals can be caught by advances in technology and investigative techniques.
Technology is a double-edged sword for criminals. It can help them commit a crime, but it can also leave a trail of evidence, leading the investigators right to them.
And in this case, that's exactly what happened.
So even with their age, experience, and careful planning, the Hatton Garden Gang was caught in the end. What happened to them?
Most of the gang members were arrested and convicted. They got sentences ranging from 6 to 7 years in prison. It shows that the law will catch up to you, even if you're experienced and think you're clever.
The Hatton Garden heist is a fascinating case. It shows how alluring crime can be, even for people who are older. It's a reminder that experience and determination can be powerful tools, but they can't beat good police work and advancements in forensic science.
And it makes you wonder about these guys. Why risk everything at that age? Was it the money, the thrill of the challenge? Did they want to prove they could still do it? Or was it all of those things?
It's a reminder that crime is a complex thing. There are often motivations that go beyond simple greed.
Exactly. And it shows that crime, even when it's audacious like this, can be something that people do their whole lives. A back and forth between the criminals and the law that goes on until the very end.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of legendary heists. We've explored cases from all over the world, spanning centuries. From the incredibly planned Antwerp diamond heist to the super bold Great Train Robbery. But our journey through these incredible crimes, it's not over yet.
These stories, they don't just show us how clever these criminals are, they also show us how important the investigators are, the people who have to figure out what happened, analyze all the evidence, and then ultimately bring those responsible to justice.
Exactly. So let's shift our focus now to a heist that targeted one of the most classic symbols of wealth and luxury, diamonds. But this time, we're not in Antwerp. We're going to the sunny shores of California for the United California Bank heist back in 1972.
This heist takes us to Laguna Niguel, California, where a gang led by Emil Dincio, a pretty well-known guy in the criminal world, set their sights on the United California Bank. Their goal was ambitious, to say the least. They wanted to steal something like $9 million from the bank's vault, which everyone thought was super secure.
$9 million back in 1972. That's a crazy amount of money. It's interesting how the value of money changes over time, but the idea of getting a huge score, that never seems to go out of style. So what was their plan? Did they try those intricate tunnel techniques we've seen in other cases?
Nope. This heist was more direct, more explosive, you could say. They decided to use dynamite to get into the vault.
Dynamite. That's pretty bold. Very different from the subtle and meticulous approach we saw in Antwerp. It seems like they weren't too worried about keeping things low-key or leaving a clean crime scene.
They were daring and determined, but they didn't just rely on brute force. They also did a lot of careful planning and observation. They studied the bank's security routines, the guard patterns, the traffic flow, anything to find weaknesses they could exploit. They even rented a townhouse nearby and turned it into a surveillance post so they could watch everything the bank was doing.
That's a classic tactic. Knowledge is power, right? If you understand how your target works and where the vulnerabilities are, you're more likely to succeed. They were playing the long game, gathering information, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
They knew that patience is key, especially in the world of high-stakes crime. If you rush into a heist without preparing, it's probably going to end badly. They took their time, analyzed everything, made sure that when they made their move, it would be quick, decisive, and successful.
So they had their plan, they knew their target inside and out. How did they actually pull off this daring heist?
They waited for nightfall, and then they moved quickly and purposefully. They planted the explosives, making sure to time the detonation so they'd minimize damage, but maximize their access to the vault. The explosion, it must have been incredibly loud. It shattered any illusion of security, announcing their presence in a dramatic and unforgettable way.
It was a real statement, like they were saying, we're here, and we're not afraid of anything. What happened next?
Once the vault was open, they wasted no time. They grabbed the cash, stuffed it into bags, and disappeared into the night. They were in and out, leaving a scene of chaos and destruction, but hardly any evidence to connect them to the crime.
It sounds like a textbook getaway. It shows how well they planned, how well they executed their plan, and how good they were at disappearing. But as we've seen before, even the best criminals can mess up. They can leave clues that can unravel everything. What led to their capture?
Well, even though they were careful, they made a few mistakes. They didn't get rid of all the evidence. Things like tools and clothes they used during the robbery, those little oversights ended up being their downfall.
It's amazing how one tiny detail, a moment of carelessness, can ruin a perfectly good plan. It shows how important it is to pay attention to even the smallest things, especially when you're committing a crime. So what happened next?
The FBI, they were in charge of investigating this big heist, and they went over the crime scene meticulously, gathering every piece of evidence, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. They analyzed the explosives, traced the tools, tested the clothes, looking for anything that could lead them to the people who did it.
It's like a giant puzzle, isn't it? Each piece of evidence is a part of the bigger picture. And the investigators, with their skill and dedication, they slowly put it all together.
And they were successful. They connected the dots, traced the evidence back to the gang members, and that led to their arrests.
Justice prevailed. It shows how important forensic science is. And it's a reminder that even the most daring criminals can be brought down by their own mistakes, no matter how small those mistakes might seem.
The United California bank heist is such a great story. It shows how bold and determined these criminals can be. But it also shows how important forensic science is and how important it is to never give up on the pursuit of justice.
It's a reminder that even when criminals think they've gotten away with it, the truth usually comes out. And justice, in the end, is usually served.
Now let's go back to Europe for a heist that's become almost legendary. The 1908 Bizdani raid. It happened in what's now Lithuania. And this one is different because it wasn't about money or personal gain. It was a political act of rebellion, a daring raid by people who were fighting for their nation's freedom.
This heist takes us back to a time of empires and revolutions, when the map of Europe was changing and the fight for independence was everywhere. At the center of this story is Józef Pilsudski, a Polish revolutionary and statesman. He would later become the leader of Poland.
Pilsudski was a charismatic leader with a vision. He dedicated his life to fighting for Polish independence. He knew that to challenge the Russian Empire, which controlled Poland at the time, he needed resources, money, weapons, supplies. And he figured, what better way to get those resources than to strike at the heart of the empire? Go after the system that transported their wealth and kept them in control.
So they went after a Russian mail train, carrying government funds, a symbol of the empire's power, and a source of the resources they desperately needed for their struggle. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a statement, a bold act of defiance against an oppressive regime.
They weren't career criminals driven by greed. They were revolutionaries, patriots. They were willing to risk their lives for their cause. They saw this heist as a way to fight back against their oppressors, to fund their operations, and to inspire others to join them.
It was a high-risk operation. If they failed, the consequences could be severe. But they were determined. They believed in their cause. They believed what they were doing was necessary. So how did they actually pull this off?
They got together a group of about 20 people, men and women, including 4 women, and one of them would later become Pilsudski's wife. They planned everything carefully, studied the train's route, the security measures, the layout of the train cars, looking for any weaknesses they could use.
They were incredibly thorough. They knew their success depended on anticipating problems, adapting to unexpected situations, and carrying out their plan with precision and determination. It was a risky mission, but they believed the potential rewards were worth the risk.
They disguised themselves as passengers to blend in, hid their weapons and explosives under their clothes, ready to use them if they had to.
It must have been incredibly tense, surrounded by potential enemies. Every move they made could have been their last. What happened next?
As the train approached the station in Bezdani, the town they'd chosen, they made their move. They used bombs to create chaos and confusion, disrupting everything, scaring the passengers and the crew. There was a shootout, a chaotic and deadly exchange between the revolutionaries and the Russian guards. People were killed on both sides.
It sounds like a very intense and dangerous situation. A reminder that the fight for freedom often comes at a high price. Were they successful?
Despite the resistance, Pilsudski and his group managed to get to the mail car and escape with a lot of money. Around 200,000 rubles. It was a victory, a testament to their bravery and determination. But it was also a reminder of the sacrifices people make in the pursuit of freedom.
It's a powerful story. It shows how a train robbery can become a catalyst for political change and a symbol of national pride. It reminds us that history is shaped by acts of courage, defiance, and people who are willing to fight for a better future. What do they do with the money?
They used it to fund their fight for Polish independence. They bought weapons and supplies. And they supported the families of those who had died fighting. The Bezdani raid became a symbol of their resistance against Russia. It showed how committed they were to their cause, and it inspired others who wanted freedom.
It's incredible how something that seems like a simple train robbery can have such a huge impact. It's a reminder that history is often shaped by acts of courage and defiance, and people who are determined to create a better future.
The Bezdani raid is a great example of how a heist can be more than just a crime. It can be a way to express political dissent, to rebel against an oppressive government, and to symbolize a nation's struggle for independence.
Now, let's switch gears completely and talk about a heist that wasn't about stealing money or valuables in the traditional sense, but it had huge consequences. It shook American democracy and led to a president resigning.
You're talking about Watergate, the break-in in 1972. It started as a seemingly small crime, but it quickly turned into a political firestorm that brought down the Nixon administration and changed American history forever.
Our sources tell us about a group of men connected to the Nixon administration. They broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Their goal wasn't to steal money or jewels. They were after something much more valuable in politics: information.
They wanted to get an advantage. They wanted information that they could use to hurt the Democratic Party's campaign in the 1972 election. It was political espionage, a secret operation to try and make sure one party won over the other.
It was a risky move and ethically questionable. It went against the basic principles of democracy and fair play. It's amazing how the desire for power can make people do things that are wrong, things that undermine the very system they claim to be a part of.
They thought they were justified, that winning the election, no matter what it took, was the most important thing. They underestimated the power of the press, the public's need to know the truth, and the strength of the American political system.
So how did they carry out this secret operation?
They went into the Watergate Hotel at night, hiding in the shadows, acting like everything was normal. They got past security, picked locks, disabled alarms. They moved like ghosts. Their goal was to plant listening devices and steal documents. Things that could damage the Democrats' campaign, expose their strategies, make people question their honesty, and swing the election in favor of President Nixon.
It was a well-planned operation, a mix of spying and political sabotage. It showed how determined they were to win no matter what. But their plan didn't work, did it?
No. Even though they planned everything carefully, they made one big mistake. They got caught. Security guards noticed something was wrong, something out of place. They didn't buy the story about it being a normal night at the Watergate Hotel.
It just goes to show that even the best laid plans can fall apart. Sometimes it's bad luck, sometimes it's carelessness, sometimes it's just one observant person who notices something isn't right.
At first, their arrest seemed like a small thing, just a break-in. But journalists and investigators started digging deeper, following the evidence, connecting the dots, and they uncovered a whole web of connections that led straight to the White House.
The story blew up. It went from a small break-in to a huge national scandal, a political earthquake that shook the foundations of American democracy.
The Watergate scandal showed a dark side of American politics, a world of dirty tricks, illegal spying, and people who didn't care about the law. It showed how fragile democracy can be and what happens when people in power aren't held accountable.
What happened after that?
The scandal unfolded slowly. The media kept digging for the truth. They found cover-ups, lies, and abuses of power that went all the way to the top. People stopped trusting the Nixon administration, and more people demanded justice.
It was a turning point in American history, a time when people's faith in their leaders was tested, and the principles of democracy were reaffirmed.
The Watergate scandal ended with President Nixon resigning, which was shocking and unprecedented. It showed how powerful the press can be, how important accountability is, and how resilient the American political system can be.
The Watergate break-in wasn't a traditional heist in the sense of stealing money or valuables, but it was still a heist. It was a heist of information, a theft of trust, an attack on the core of democracy.
It's a warning. It shows us that power without limits can be dangerous. And when people want political power so much that they don't care about ethics, the consequences can be terrible.
Let's take a break from the serious stuff for a minute. Let's talk about a heist that wasn't as historically important as Watergate, but it's still pretty amazing, and it involved a very unusual target: maple syrup.
This robbery happened in Quebec, Canada, back in 2012. And they got away with over $18 million worth of maple syrup. From a storage facility, people were fascinated by it. It was a symbol of how creative criminals can be and, well, how strange the things people are willing to steal can be.
$18 million worth of maple syrup. It's a lot of pancakes. You don't hear about heists involving maple syrup very often. What makes this one so unique?
It was well organized. The level of planning and execution was impressive, especially considering what they were stealing. They got into the storage facility, got past the security, and then they replaced the syrup with water to hide what they were doing.
They swapped the good stuff with plain water. That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
It would buy them some time to escape before anyone noticed. But I'm sure someone figured it out eventually.
Oh, yeah. The workers at the facility, they started to get suspicious. They tested the syrup and realized that it wasn't syrup at all. It was just water. The authorities were called right away, and a huge investigation started.
It's interesting how something like stealing maple syrup can trigger such a big investigation. What happened after that?
The investigators, they were confused at first. It was such a bold crime, but they followed the evidence. They looked into financial transactions, interviewed people, and they tracked down people who they suspected were involved in the black market for maple syrup.
It's incredible how even the strangest stolen goods can be tracked. Criminals always leave a trail, and if you follow it carefully, it can lead you right to them. Did they find the stolen syrup?
They found most of it. The investigation led them to a whole network of people who were involved in the theft and then selling the syrup. They made arrests, people were charged, and justice was served, even if it was a little bit sticky and sweet.
The Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist, as we like to call it, shows us that crime can take many forms. Criminals can target anything. It highlights how clever criminals can be, how determined law enforcement is, and how much we love stories about daring heists and the pursuit of justice.
It also reminds us that even in a world that's obsessed with technology and complicated cybercrimes, sometimes the most valuable things are the simple things. Things we often take for granted, like the taste of maple syrup on pancakes.
We've gone on a journey through time and across continents. We've explored all kinds of heists. Each one shows us something about human ingenuity, ambition, and the never-ending pursuit of wealth, power, or sometimes even a just cause. We've gotten into the minds of criminal masterminds, analyzed their plans, and seen the successes and failures of both the criminals and the people who try to catch them.
These stories remind us that crime is complex. It's a mix of careful planning, daring actions, and the constant presence of the law.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of heists, I hope you've learned something new about these crimes, the reasons people commit them, and the efforts to protect our valuables, our institutions, and ourselves.
And remember, as you go about your day, keep your eyes open. Be curious. You never know. Maybe a normal, everyday situation might actually be hiding a fascinating heist just waiting to be discovered.